But even as Shute wrote, Australia was in the process of becoming a very different country. In World War II, it had suffered a kind of blunt trauma when, after the fall of Burma and Singapore, Britain pulled out of the Far East, leaving Australia suddenly alone and dangerously exposed. At the same time, Winston Churchill, a man whose presumptuousness was never less than enthralling, asked Australia's military leaders to divert their troops to India, in effect to abandon their wives and children and fight for the greater good of empire. The Australians decided they could not. Instead, they stayed behind and fought a rear-guard action to try to stop the Japanese advance across New Guinea. Not many people outside Australia realized just how close the Japanese got. They had captured most of the Solomon Islands and much of New Guinea just to the north and seemed poised for an invasion. The Australian military, knowing the position was hopeless, drew up a plan to fall back to the southeast corner of the country, sacrificing nearly the whole of the continent in the hope of defending the main cities. It could have been no more than a delaying tactic. Luckily, the tide of battle moved elsewhere after the American naval victory at Midway, and Australia was reprieved. Australia escaped, but it was left with two scars: a realization that Britain could not be counted on to come to its rescue in a crisis, and a sense of immense vulnerability to the teeming and unstable countries to the north. Both of these matters deeply influenced Australian attitudes in the post-war years, indeed still do. Australia became seized with the conviction that it must populate or perish, that if it didn't use all that empty land and fill all those empty spaces, someone from outside might do it for them. So in the years after the war, the country threw open its doors. In the half-century after 1945, its population soared from 7 million to 18 million. Britain alone couldn't provide necessary bodies, so people were welcomed from all over Europe, particularly Greece and Italy in the immediate post-war years, making the nation vastly more cosmopolitan. Suddenly, Australia was full of people who liked wine and good coffee and olives and eggplants, and realized that spaghetti didn't have to be a vivid orange and come from cans. The whole warp and rhythm of life changed. Good neighbor councils were established everywhere to help the immigrants settle and feel welcomed, and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation offered English language courses which were enthusiastically taken up by tens of thousands. By 1970, the country could boast of 2.5 million new Australians, as they were known. Of course, it wasn't perfect. In the fever to populate, some migrants were accepted with less reflection than might have been wished. At least 10,000 children, many as young as 4, were dispatched from British orphanages between 1947 and 1967 by child welfare groups like the Salvation Army, Balnados, and the Christian Brothers. The impulse was genuinely altruistic. It was felt that the children would have a chance of a better life in a country that was warm and sunny and needed labor. But the execution often lacked subtlety. Siblings were frequently parted, never to meet again, and many of the children had essentially no notion of what was happening to them. In his book Orphans of the Empire, Alan Gill notes how one little boy, seeing a sign announcing the mustering point for the Balnaldo's party, was thrilled because he presumed party meant cake and ice cream. Another inquired, as the ship made its way up the Thames, whether they would be home in time for tea. Stories don't get a great deal more poignant than that. There was also the deep odium of the White Australia policy, which allowed immigration officials to keep out undesirables by requiring them to pass a literacy test in any European language of the authorities' choosing, including on one famous occasion Scottish Gaelic, and to deport non-whites with little thought of compassion. In the early 1950s, Arthur Calwell, the Minister for Immigration, tried to repatriate the Indonesian-born widow and 8 children of an Australian citizen. If Australians have a single radiant virtue, it is the belief in a fair go, a sense of the fundamental rightness of common justice, and the case caused an outcry. The courts told Calwell to get real, and the more insensitive side of the exclusion policy swiftly began to erode. Around 1970, as Australia increasingly recognized that it was, at least geographically, an Asian nation and not an European one, the color bar came down and hundreds of thousands of immigrants were let in from across the region. Today, Australia is one of the most multicultural countries on earth. A third of the people in Sydney were born in another country. In Melbourne, the 4 most common surnames are Smith, Brown, Jones, and Nguyen. Across the country as a whole, almost a quarter of the people have no British antecedents on either side of their families. For millions of people, it truly was a chance of a new life. One that, on the whole, was generously extended and gratefully accepted. In a single generation, Australia remade itself. It went from being a half-forgotten outpost of Britain, provincial, dull, and culturally dependent, to being a nation infinitely more sophisticated, confident, interesting, and outward-looking. And it did all this by and large without discord or disturbance or serious mistakes, indeed often with a kind of grace. By coincidence, a few nights earlier I had watched a television documentary about the immigrant experience in the 1950s. One of the people interviewed was a man who had arrived from Hungary as a teenager after the uprising there. On his first full day in the country, he had gone as instructed to the local police station and explained in halting English that he was a new immigrant who had been told to register his address. The sergeant had stared at him for a moment, then risen from his seat and come around the desk. The Hungarian recalled that for one bewildered moment he thought the policeman might be able to strike him, but instead the sergeant thrust out a meaty hand and said warmly, "Welcome to Australia, son." The Hungarian recalled the incident with wonder even now, and when he finished, there were tears in his eyes. "I tell you sincerely, it's a wonderful country."